In a small suburb where the houses were packed like matchboxes, there lived a guy named Dan. He was in his 30s tall, with broad shoulders and hands covered with scars from working with tools. He was a carpenter, repairing roofs, windows, doors until his fingers began to bleed from splinters. Dan lived alone in an old house he bought for pennies, a 2-story building with a sagging facade, and an attic that smelled of dust and something musty, like rotting boards. The house was his pride, although the neighbors whispered that it was too old and creaked, as if someone wandered at night. Dan waved it away. He knew it was just the wind and the crumbling beams. His day started early: coffee, black and bitter, in a rusty mug, then work from dawn to dusk. He loved the smell of fresh wood and the sound of hammering, but he rarely rested at home because there were too many things to do. He hardly ever visited the attic, only occasionally to pick up old toolboxes or check for leaks. The stairs to the attic were narrow, with bent steps that creaked under his weight, and the hatch was heavy, with rusty hinges. Upstairs, there were things left by the previous owners: old magazines, yellowed photographs, torn furniture covered with cobwebs. Dan didn't like to go in there. It was too cramped, too stuffy, and the light of the flashlight cast strange shadows on the walls. One evening, after a long day, Dan heard a knock. Not outside, but somewhere overhead in the attic. At first he thought it was squirrels or birds, but the sound was heavy, as if someone was walking in heavy boots. He turned on the radio to muffle the noise, but the knocking was repeated. 3 beats, then a pause. 3 beats. Dan turned off the radio, picked up a flashlight and a hammer, and climbed the stairs, which creaked under his weight. Opening the hatch, he illuminated the attic. Empty, just dust and boxes. But the smell had changed. Now it smelled not only of dust, but also of something metallic, like blood or rust. He walked around, checked the corners, but found nothing except an old suitcase that he hadn't noticed before. The suitcase was locked, with peeling leather and a corroded lock. Dan went downstairs, deciding that he would sort out in the morning, but the knock came again, closer to midnight, and this time it was mixed with some kind of muffled groan. The next day, he returned to the attic with tools, a lockpick and pliers. The suitcase opened with difficulty, creaking as if it didn't want to give away its secrets. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, written in different handwriting, with dates that had been erased by time. One of them, on the top layer, was addressed to Dan, although he had never seen that handwriting. The letter said, "You shouldn't have come here. Now you know too much." Dan froze, his heart pounding. He reread the letter. It was handwritten, the ink was smudged, but the words were clear. He threw the letters in the trash, but the pounding didn't subside. That night, he heard not only footsteps, but also a voice, low, hoarse, as if someone was whispering his name through a crack in the floor. Dan began to suspect that someone had broken into the house. He checked the windows. Everything was locked. The doors were double locked. But the attic remained a mystery. He installed an old lock on the hatch, but the footsteps continued, now in the afternoon, when he was at work. The neighbors, those who were still talking to him, began to whisper that something was wrong in the house, but Dan did not believe in fairy tales. He bought a camera, a small one with night vision, and put it in the attic, pointing it at the suitcase. The next morning, after checking the recording, he saw only shadows, vague, but moving like human figures. Dan didn't know who it was, but he assumed it was thieves or tramps who had climbed through the roof. He armed himself with a hammer and a knife and began to keep watch at night, sitting at the foot of the stairs. One day, when he was dozing in an armchair, he was awakened by a scream, not his, but a woman's piercing, from the attic. Dan rushed up, opened the hatch, and saw the blood. Fresh, on the floor, the drops were reaching for the suitcase. He ran over and opened it. There was a new note inside, this time with blood on the edges. "You're next." Dan ran out, leaving the hammer, but returned an hour later, deciding that it was a joke or a hallucination. But the smell of blood remained, and a new sound appeared in the attic, a wheeze, as if someone was breathing heavily behind the boxes. He found an old jacket soaked in something sticky there, and realized that it wasn't just fear, it was a reality he couldn't escape. Dan stood in the attic, holding a hammer in one hand and flashlight in the other, and looked at the jacket soaked in a sticky substance that smelled of rust and something else, rot maybe. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it echoing in his own head, and the flashlight's light was shaking, picking out boxes, cobwebs, and bloodstains on the floor. He picked up the jacket, trying to figure out where it had come from, but it felt heavy, as if there was something inside. He threw it on the floor, and a key fell out of his sleeve, an old one with a jagged edge, covered with rust, but clearly suitable for a lock on the suitcase. Dan froze, remembering the letters and the new note with the blood. It was too much. Someone was playing with him, and he didn't know who. He took the key, inserted it into the lock of the suitcase, and it clicked open with a dull creak. There were not only letters inside, but also dozens of photographs of people he had never seen. Some had markings on them. John, 3 days. Mary, 12 hours. Tom did not scream. Dan felt his stomach clench, but before he could do anything, there was a rustling sound from behind, followed by a heavy thump on his back. He fell to his knees, dropping the flashlight, and turned around. There was a man standing in the attic, tall, in dirty work clothes, with a face covered with scars and dried blood. He was holding a metal pipe in his hands, and Dan could tell from his eyes that this was no random tramp. "You're too nosy," the man said hoarsely, lifting the pipe. Dan rolled to the side, and the pipe crashed into the floor, splitting the board. He grabbed a hammer and hit the man on the leg. The crunch of the bone echoed through the attic. The man growled but did not fall, and instead hit Dan on the arm. The hammer fell out, and Dan felt his fingers go numb from the pain. He rushed to the hatch, but the man grabbed his leg, pulling him back. Dan kicked him in the face with his heel, smashing his nose, and escaped by jumping down the stairs. He fell to the floor of the first floor, hitting his shoulder, but did not stop. He ran out into the street, leaving the door wide open. It was dark outside, with only streetlights illuminating the empty road, but Dan could hear footsteps behind him, heavy and confident, as if the man wasn't going to stop. He ran to the neighboring house, knocked on the door, but no one answered. Then he hid behind bushes, trying to catch his breath, and noticed how another person came out of his house, a woman with short hair and a jacket stained with mud. She was holding a flashlight and talking into her phone, but Dan couldn't hear the words. They were working together, and that scared him more than the blow itself. The next morning, Dan returned home armed with a knife and a camera. He knew he couldn't leave the house, but he couldn't stay unprotected either. The attic was empty, but the blood remained, and the suitcase was gone. In its place was a new note attached to the beam with a nail. "You will not escape. We know where you are." Dan realized that it wasn't just random thieves. It was a network, a group of people who were using his house for something terrible. He installed a night vision camera everywhere, in the living room, in the kitchen, in the attic, and waited. That night, the cameras recorded the movement. A man with a pipe appeared in the attic, the one with a bloody nose, but now with a bandage on his face. He brought a suitcase, opened it, and took out tools, pliers, a saw, knives, all covered with stains that Dan didn't want to recognize. A woman came in behind him, the one with the lantern, and they began discussing something in whispers. The camera caught them pulling a body out of a suitcase, a young woman, bound, gagged, but alive. She was twitching, but the ropes held her tight. The man picked up the saw, and Dan, watching through the screen, felt his stomach twist. He turned off the camera so he couldn't see, but the woman's scream, muffled by the gag, reached him anyway. Dan couldn't stand it. He grabbed a knife, ran up to the attic, and burst into the room. The man turned around, but Dan had already stabbed him in the shoulder. The woman screamed and rushed to him with a flashlight, but Dan pushed her, and she fell, hitting her head on a beam. Blood flowed across the floor, mixing with the stains left earlier. The man pulled out a knife and tried to stab Dan, but he grabbed a saw and plunged it into his chest. The scream ended, and the man collapsed, wheezing until his eyes froze. Dan untied the woman. Her hands were blue from ropes, and her face was wet with tears. She didn't speak, just trembled, but Dan realized that she was in shock. He took her downstairs, but he heard footsteps outside, heavy as a marching step. He looked out the window. 3 new people in work clothes with tools and a camera were approaching the house. One was holding a canister of gasoline, the other was holding an axe. Dan locked the door, but the glass in the living room shattered, and the axe plunged into the wall. The woman screamed, but Dan covered her mouth, whispering, "Quiet, or we're both going to die." They hid in the basement, which smelled of damp and old pipes. Dan could hear people moving around the house, furniture breaking, and someone shouting his name. He turned on his phone to call for help, but there was no network. Then he noticed another suitcase in the corner of the basement, the same one as in the attic. Opening it, he found the photos, myself working on the roof, sleeping in a room, walking down the street. Each one had a note. Dan is next. There was a note at the bottom. We've always been here. Dan pressed the woman against the basement wall, feeling her trembling transmitted through his hand. The stench of dampness and rotting pipes clogged his nose, but he didn't pay attention. The footsteps above grew louder, the trampling like a herd mixed with the cracking of breaking boards. One of them was shouting his name, a low, hoarse voice that echoed through the concrete walls. Dan covered her mouth, but her eyes, full of horror, followed every sound. He heard the axe hit the wall again, the glass of a living room shattering into splinters, and then a metallic clang, a click that made his hair stand on end. It was a sound he couldn't mistake for anything else, the sound of a machine gun being cocked, possibly an AK-47, cold and ominous, like a death sentence. Dan peeked through the crack in the basement door and saw them. 3 men in work jackets with dirty faces, one holding a canister of gasoline, another an axe, and the third tall with a bald head and a tattoo of a snake on his neck, clutching a machine gun. The gun was pointed upward, and Dan noticed how the man was moving it around the room, as if looking for a target. The woman behind him began to breathe faster, but he shushed her, afraid that her wheezing would betray them. The gunman shouted, "Dan, come out, or we'll burn everything to hell." His voice was calm, almost emotionless, like a man who had done this more than once. Dan knew that the basement wasn't a shelter. He noticed an old cabinet in the corner, full of tools and wooden boards, and pushed the woman there, whispering, "Be quiet, or he will find you." She huddled inside, clutching her arms to her chest, and Dan grabbed a crowbar from the pile of junk and got ready. A minute later, the basement hatch collapsed with a crash, and the gunman descended, holding his weapon at the ready. His companions stayed upstairs, pouring gasoline on the house. The smell of fuel became unbearable, mixing with the smoke that was already seeping through the cracks. The gunman stopped, examining the basement, and Dan, holding his breath, hit him on the back with a crowbar. The metal bit into the flesh with a thud, and the man fell to his knees, dropping the machine gun. Dan rushed to his weapon, but the gunman grabbed his leg, knocking him to the floor. They wrestled, rolling on the dirty concrete, until Dan drove a crowbar into his opponent's shoulder. Blood splattered, flooding the floor, but the machine gunner did not scream. He only wheezed, trying to reach the machine gun. Dan grabbed him first, but at that moment there was a burst from above. Bullets pierced the ceiling. One hit the wall next to him, the other hit the leg of a woman hidden in a closet. She screamed, and Dan, without hesitation, shot up, aiming at the sound. The screams had died down, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. He pulled the woman out of the closet. Her leg was bleeding, the skin was torn, the bone was visible under the meat. She moaned, but Dan gagged her with a cloth he found on the shelf. "Be quiet, or they'll kill us," he hissed, but she couldn't stop herself. He heard footsteps above his head. Someone was coming down, and Dan, with a machine gun in his hands, hid behind the pipes. 2 men entered, one with an axe, the other with a torch lit from gasoline. The flames lit up the basement, and Dan saw their faces, empty with burnt-out eyes, like zombies, but alive, real. He fired, hitting one in the chest, and he collapsed, choking on blood. The second one rushed at Dan with an axe, but missed, and Dan hit him on the head with the butt. The skull cracked, blood spilled onto the floor, and the man fell, twitching in agony. Dan grabbed the woman, dragging her to the exit, but the house was already on fire. Fire licked the walls, smoke filled the basement, making it difficult to breathe. He broke down the back door, running out into the field behind the house, where the grass was dry and prickly. The woman was moaning, and her leg was bleeding more, but Dan didn't stop. He could hear gunshots behind him. Someone was shooting from afar. Bullets were plunging into the ground nearby, raising fountains of dust. Dan realized that this was surveillance. They knew where he was running to. They knew his every move. He looked around and noticed a drone, a small one with a camera, hovering over the field, illuminating them with its headlights. "They're watching," he shouted, but the woman was already fainting. They hid in an old barn, which smelled of hay and rusty iron. Dan laid the woman on the straw, bandaging her leg with his shirt, but the blood did not stop. He noticed a camera on the wall, an old one with wires connected to a battery. Someone filmed them, like in a reality show. He pulled out the wires, but the drone outside hovered closer, and a voice from the speaker said, "Dan, you can't hide. We know where you are." He fired at the drone, and it fell, shattering into pieces, but immediately a second one appeared, with a camera and a light, illuminating the barn from the inside. Dan heard footsteps outside, heavy and confident, like those who are not afraid of death. He raised his machine gun, ready to fire, but the woman, in a weak voice, whispered, "These are not people. It's a car." He didn't understand, but he saw the barn door open, and a new person entered, a woman, not the one in the attic, but another with short hair and scars on her arms. She was holding a pistol in her hands, but she wasn't shooting, and she was looking at it as if it were an exhibit. "You're our main act," she said, and Dan noticed that 3 more people were standing behind her, with cameras filming his every move. One of them was holding a knife, another an axe, and the third a canister of gasoline. They didn't hurry, as if they knew he wasn't going anywhere. Dan fired, hitting the woman in the arm, and she fell, but the others rushed to him. He stabbed one in the stomach, but the other's axe slammed into his shoulder, tearing his muscles. Blood gushed out, drenching the floor, but Dan didn't stop. He fired again, hitting the other man in the leg, but the canister fell, and gasoline spilled over the hay. One of them set it on fire, and the fire broke out, devouring the barn. Dan grabbed the woman he had saved and ran to the exit, but the flames surrounded them, and he felt the skin on his hands begin to melt. She screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the crackle of the fire. Dan dragged the woman across the field as the fire behind him consumed the barn, leaving behind black smoke that rose to the sky like a distress signal. Her leg was bleeding harder, the skin on it was burned, and the skin on his arms was bubbling from the heat, leaving red, wet spots. She was moaning, her voice was weak, but Dan couldn't stop. Bullets were whistling around, piercing the ground and raising fountains of dust. A new drone with a camera and a bright spotlight followed them, illuminating every step like a spotlight on a stage. A voice came from the speaker, the same low, hoarse voice. "Dan, you're not leaving. We always see you." Dan stumbled, falling to his knees, and the woman slipped out of his arms, moaning in pain. Her leg looked terrible. The bone was sticking out of the wound, the meat was torn, and the blood was mixed with dirt. He lifted her up, but he heard footsteps, heavy as marching steps, approaching from different sides of the field. 3 new people emerged from the darkness, men in work jackets, with faces covered with soot and scars, like those who had not seen the sun for a long time. One was holding an AK-47, the other an axe with a rusty blade, the third a canister of gasoline and a lighter. Their eyes were empty, like dolls, but their movements were precise, like machines. The gunman raised his weapon, and Dan, without hesitation, fired his machine gun, which was still in his hands. The bullet hit the shooter's leg, and he fell, screaming, but not from pain, from anger. Dan rushed to him, pulled out the machine gun, but the other man's axe crashed into his back, opening the skin and muscles. Blood gushed out, drenching his shirt, and Dan fell, gasping in pain. He rolled over, firing again, hitting the second man in the chest. The axe fell out, and he collapsed, wheezing until blood flooded his throat. A third man with a canister stepped closer, splashing gasoline on Dan and the woman. The smell of fuel mixed with blood and smoke, causing nausea. Dan fired but missed, and the bullet sank into the ground. The man flicked a lighter, and the fire flared up, licking Dan's clothes. He screamed, rolling on the grass to beat out the flames, but the skin on his arms and chest was already charred. The bubbles were bursting, exposing the meat. The woman screamed, her leg twitched, but the fire got to her, devouring her clothes and hair. Her scream was cut off as flames engulfed her face, leaving only a wheeze and the smell of burnt flesh. Dan, half dead, got up, clutching the machine gun, but the drone hovered closer, illuminating his burned face. Laughter came from the speaker, low, pitched, as if someone was enjoying the sight. "You are our masterpiece," said the voice. Dan fired at the drone, and it fell, shattering into pieces, but immediately a new one appeared, with a camera and a spotlight, recording his every step. He noticed 2 more people coming out of the woods, a woman, the one with short hair and scars, and a man with a bald head and a tattoo of a snake, the one he killed in the attic, but now alive, with a bandage on his chest where there was a saw wound. His face was pale, but his eyes were sparkling like a psychopath's. Dan fired, hitting the woman in the shoulder, but the man with the tattoo rushed at him, ripping out the machine gun. They wrestled, rolling on the ground, until Dan hit him with a rock he found in the grass. The skull cracked, blood gushed out, but the man did not die. He wheezed, laughed like a madman, until Dan plunged a stone into his eye. The eye burst with a wet slurp, and blood flooded Dan's face, but he didn't stop. He struck again, smashing his head into a mess of bones and flesh until the man was still. Dan got up, covered in blood and dirt, but he heard a new sound, a helicopter. A small drone with a loudspeaker flew out of the forest, and a helicopter appeared behind it, illuminating the field with a searchlight. A voice came from the speaker. "Dan, you're our finale. Take off your mask." He didn't understand, but he noticed that his camera, the one he had installed at home, was now broadcasting his face on the drone screen. They've been following him from the beginning, through his own recordings, through drones, through a network he couldn't understand. He fired at the helicopter, but the bullets bounced off, and the voice laughed. "You won't stop us." Dan ran to the river, dragging the machine gun, but his legs were weak from pain and burns. His skin hung in rags, blood dripped onto the grass, and the drone followed him, recording every step. He hid in the bushes, but he heard footsteps, not heavy, but light like a child's. A girl, about 10 years old, in a dirty dress, with a face covered with bruises and blood, came out of the darkness. She was holding a knife in her hands, a small kitchen knife, but sharp. "You have to stay," she said calmly, and Dan noticed that her eyes were empty, like those he had killed. She took a step closer, and Dan, without hesitation, fired. The bullet hit her arm, but she did not scream, just smiled and rushed at him with a knife. And looked at the girl standing in front of him with a knife in her hand, and felt his mind crack like a dry branch under his foot. Her face, covered in bruises and blood, was too calm. Her eyes were empty, like a mannequin's, but her movements were precise, like a predator's. The knife in her childish hand was shiny, sharp, with a jagged edge, and Dan noticed how her fingers gripped the handle, leaving red spots on it, her own blood from the wound on her arm, where the bullet had hit. He stepped back, but his legs were buckling from burns and blood. The skin on his arms and chest was charred. The bubbles burst, exposing the meat, and the machine gun in his hands seemed heavy as concrete. The girl took a step closer. Her smile widened, revealing small teeth covered with spots, as if she was chewing something dirty. "You have to stay," she repeated, and her voice was thin but sharp, like the scrape of a knife on glass. Dan raised his gun, aiming at her, but his hand was shaking, and his finger on the trigger froze. He couldn't shoot. She was a child, though her gaze was more frightening than any of the people he had killed. She lunged at him, plunging the knife into his thigh. The blade entered smoothly, tearing through the muscles, and blood gushed out, drenching the grass. Dan screamed, hitting her on the head with the butt of his rifle, but she didn't fall. She just giggled as if it were a game, and hit her again, this time in the stomach. Blood flowed like a river, soaking his pants, and Dan fell to his knees, dropping the machine gun. The girl came closer. Her knife was red, and her face was now covered with his blood. She raised the weapon, put the blade to his throat, and said, "You're our finale." Dan tried to push her away, but his strength left him. Burns, wounds, blood, everything mixed into one throbbing pain. She pressed, and the knife sliced through the skin, first finely, as if on paper, then deeper, cutting through the muscles. Blood splashed into her face, but she didn't stop, continuing to cut until Dan's throat turned into a bloody wound from which a fountain gushed out. His scream ended in a rasp, and he choked on his own blood, falling face first into the grass. But it wasn't the end. The drone, still hovering over the field, approached, its camera focusing on Dan's body, recording every detail: blood, charred skin, wounds. Laughter came from the speaker, low, hoarse like everyone he'd met, but louder now, triumphant. The girl wiped the knife on the grass, leaving sticky marks on it, and said to the camera, "Next one." Her voice was calm, but there was an insane joy in it, like a person who had found his calling. The rest came out of the forest, a woman with short hair and scars, a man with a snake tattoo, now with a new headband, and 3 more with cameras, axes, and cans. They surrounded Dan's body, filming him from different angles, like directors on a movie set. The woman bent down, picked up Dan's machine gun, checked the magazine, and fired 3 shots into the air, like a salute. Bullets tore through the silence, echoing over the field, and each shot was accompanied by her laughter. She turned to the girl and said, "Good job, Laura. You're one of us now." They began to dismantle Dan's body. The man with the tattoo took an axe and chopped off his arm. Blood splattered on the grass, and the woman with the camera filmed the meat tearing, bones cracking under the blade. The other 2 splashed gasoline on the remains, and the fire broke out again, devouring what was left of Dan. His charred remains sizzled, his skin cracked, and the smell of burnt flesh mixed with smoke. The girl, Laura, came closer, holding a knife, and began to cut the skin on his face, cutting out pieces like an artist working on a sculpture. She was smiling, her mouth was red with blood, and her eyes were shining like those of a possessed woman. Then they brought a new suitcase, the same one as in the attic, and put Dan's body parts in it, an arm, a leg, a head, everything that was left. A woman with a camera recorded how they closed the suitcase, and a man with a tattoo attached a note to it. Dan, the finale of Act 3. They left, leaving the field on fire, and the drone continued filming until the flames consumed everything: grass, trees, and remains. But the next day, someone found a suitcase in the field. A new man, a young guy, with a backpack and a flashlight. He opened it, saw blood, bones, notes, and his face turned pale. Inside was a new note written in blood: "You're next if you open it." He dropped the suitcase and ran, but the drone hovering over him turned on the spotlight, and a voice from a speaker said, "Welcome to the game." Someone from a network, who was watching everything through drones and cameras, smiled, sitting in a dark room surrounded by screens where new victims were broadcast. It wasn't just hunting, it was a business, a show where every scream, every shot, every murder was recorded, mounted, and sold to those who paid for such eerie moments. Dan became part of their collection, but his death was not the last. They were already looking for the next one, and the field where he died became a new scene for their nightmare.